Yes, you should buy that cheap supercharged V8 Range Rover, and I'm going to tell you why. I know that these cars are notorious for being unreliable and terrible to own, but to be honest, I kind of call BS. I got married a couple weeks ago, and after our wedding, I bought my wife this, our 2012 Range Rover Sport with the 5-liter supercharged V8. We've only had it for a few days now, and it has been absolutely fantastic, but that doesn't really address why most people say these things are terrible to own. They're fantastic to drive, it's everything that comes after that that people have gripes with. To be honest though, this may be a new addition to my garage, and it might be something I don't have a ton of hands-on experience with just yet, but the engine and transmission out of this car, along with a ton of the DNA, are almost identical to our Jaguar XFR. And if you've been following along with the channel, you know that that car is an amazing nightmare. But to be honest, with the things and problems addressed, these cars really aren't that bad. The ownership experience is supposed to be incredibly similar to the XFR. It just so happens that the XFR is a much lesser known car than this is. And if you're buying a car just with the entire hope that you're never gonna have to do any work, you're not gonna have to screw with it or fix it or anything like that, these cars really aren't for you. But if you're willing to do a bit of due diligence and kind of go in knowing some things that you probably should know, these cars are fantastic. They do definitely have some noteworthy issues that a guy needs to be careful around. The timing chains and the timing chain tensioners are something that should be done on all of these. If you're buying one over 100,000 kilometers or approximately 60,000 miles, you should definitely be digging to see if the timing chains have been done. And if they have not, you should be getting that set up to do. These cars are pretty bad for the air suspension. The air suspension from factory is amazing, but it is also incredibly problem-ridden. Thankfully, on this car specifically, the air suspension has been converted to traditional spring, so it doesn't have as many of the cool modes and things that the air suspension can offer with adjustable ride height and different traction surfaces and whatever else, but it does still drive very smooth and very nice, and it is something that's a bit of a sacrifice, but a sacrifice for reliability. And beyond that, the biggest issue that these cars have is that right there being the supercharger. And obviously I am very familiar with those. It is the exact same blower that is on the XFR because it is the exact same engine out of the XFR. And they're known for kind of giving false issues. Obviously the coupler in them, because there's a coupler between the shaft of the supercharger and the actual rotor packs themselves. And factory, it comes with a sprung one that as it wears out, makes a lot of noise. And that is something that a guy should replace. It's relatively cheap and easy. Beyond that, these superchargers do need a rebuild once in a while. Obviously we are midway through the process with that right now, I just finished rebuilding the blower on the XFR. And I mean, it really wasn't that bad. Beyond that, the superchargers, the suspension, and the timing chains are the three main issues with these cars. Outside of that, if you keep a good battery in it, make sure you keep it clean and keep an eye on things, you will have some more out of the ordinary problems than you will with a traditional car. But I don't think, personally at least, it's anything unmanageable or anything too bad. After all, the gearbox in this car is just a standard ZF 6-speed torque converted auto. It shifts very well and it does very good, but it is relatively easy to find. Parts and whatever else pretty cheap from that standpoint. There's a lot of these cars out there. If you're looking for parts, they can be found, especially if you're willing to do a little bit of digging and find used parts and whatever else. These cars are fantastic to drive for what they are. In factory form, they're not quite as animalistic, but in a way, this is incredibly similar to, say, what a Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk is, just at an, very small fraction of the price. We paid $12,000 for this car, and it does have a couple things it needs and a couple minor gremlins with it. Nothing too crazy, and right now I would trust it to drive pretty much anywhere. In fact, we drove it about 3 hours home when we picked it up, and it has done absolutely fantastic. But if you're looking at this as a comparison to a Trackhawk, it really isn't that far off for something that was $12,000 when you remember that a Trackhawk is more in the $100,000 range. And yes, of course, I'm talking in Canadian prices. Supercharged V8, the Trackhawks, funny enough, actually have just a newer version of this gearbox. It's an 8-speed rather than a 6-speed, but it is incredibly similar. Obviously, this one is making around 510 horsepower stock. If you look at what's possible with this engine though, they make a lot of power very easily and they handle it quite well. Obviously, I've only put around 10,000 kilometers on my Jaguar since doing all the goodies to have that pumping out an extra few hundred horsepower in all the most ridiculous ways imaginable. But there are lots of people around with the Supercharged V8 AJ133 that's in this car, making ridiculous amounts of power for a long time with very, very few issues. And I mean, beyond that, even looking around, I did a pretty deep dive before buying this car for what was available as options, and there was plenty of these cars over 200,000 kilometers still running and driving with relatively no issues. This one specifically has 137,000 kilometers on it, exactly as it sits. And overall, it definitely shows that it's got a few miles on it, but it's in incredible condition and it drives really, really well. For a car with 137,000 kilometers, this thing shows incredibly well. And I do think in person, these things look so much better than they do in pictures. Of course, this one specifically, I like that it's got the upgraded 22s off of a newer Range Rover, but the boxy shape of these cars, it really does present incredibly well in person as compared to the photos, especially when a guy can see what the newer ones look like and have them to compare to. This car at 137,000 K though, fantastic condition. The interior is absolutely beautiful. We opted to find one with the brown interior and I think it contrasts really nice with the white. We also would have taken a cream white interior, but I think we are super, super happy with this. And it just really is such a statement of luxury. And at least thus far, Hope is absolutely loving it. That being said though, let's get you guys set up and go for a bit of a drive, and I can kind of talk through a few more of the things and some of the things to watch out for when buying these, because a guy definitely does have to be careful when buying one of them, especially buying one of them smartly. That doesn't mean for a second though that you shouldn't buy one at all. Let's hop in and go for a drive. I can't get over how much value you're getting with one of these cars. For what a guy's paying on the second-hand side of things, it's absolutely crazy. If you want anything else that's this luxurious, that has materials this nice, and is this ballin', for lack of a better phrase, guy starts to look at newer Cayennes as an option. And there is some older depreciated Cayennes that would fit in a kind of similar category, but anything that's gonna compare price point to price point is going to be way less fast, and it's going to be the lower trim models versus the kind of top trim models like this is. You're looking at your G-Wagon variants, but of course all of those are quite a bit more expensive. Some of the Audi options and some of these other things that do kind of compare, but anything that's quite this nice or this fast or this luxurious, for the most part, it's all a good bit more expensive. But taking this thing for a bit of a drive, it does drive incredibly nice. Obviously, I don't have frame of reference to compare to the factory air ride to know how much a guy loses on the converted spring suspension versus the air ride, but it does do incredibly well. This thing is super, super peppy for what it is, and it's quite fantastic. I don't know, I just love driving this thing. I really genuinely love driving this thing, and that is coming from somebody who is, I don't know, I do not like sacrificing performance for all else. It's the same reason that McLaren has become one of my favorite brands, because it is just no sacrifices whatsoever except for performance. All of this being said though, yes, you should really buy one of these cars. The biggest things to look out for is you just need to find one that has had an extensive maintenance history and been very well cared for, that you have tangible proof. Honestly, I wouldn't even shy away from a high mileage example. We managed to get this one with 137,000 kilometers for 12 grand, which turned out to be an absolute steal because it does have a couple claims on the Carfax, and there's a couple minor things, like it's got a catalytic converter code. I'm gonna convert it to catless anyways, so that is not an issue to me. This car specifically has a couple of minor blemishes on the body, nothing too crazy. It's got a crack in the windshield. There's a couple things like that, but the air suspension has been dealt with and converted to springs. The timing chains have been done. The supercharger snout has been done, and the engine sounds very healthy, happy, and quiet. And if you can check off those boxes and find one that you get a fault-free starting point, these things do quite fantastically. Everybody says that they are riddled with problems, and having spent a bunch of time pulling apart more the Jaguar side of things than the Land Rover side of things, they really are fantastic that way. They've got a bad reputation, and it's kind of similar to the M6, and I'm sure there are people out there that have had a very poor ownership experience, but most of the people who have had a poor ownership experience with a car like this are the kind of people that don't understand as much what it is they're working with. They're the kind of people that probably just take it directly to a shop and have them deal with it. Because of course, if you buy one of these cars and it has any form of problems whatsoever, and you go to a Land Rover dealership and say, hey, will you please fix my car? They're gonna say, all right, sir, you need a battery replacement, and that's going to be $3,000. It's ridiculous, right? Their rates are very high, their prices for parts are very high, and all they're gonna wanna use is brand new OEM parts. It's the same reason that insurance can be expensive on these. But the reality is, if you're willing to do a bit of your own work yourself, if you're somewhat mechanically inclined, or even have a good relationship with an aftermarket shop of sorts that's willing to do stuff like your timing chains and like working on your supercharger, these cars really aren't that bad. You know, you are still paying a premium a bit for prices on parts, but really nothing too insane if you compare to what it is and some of the other options out there. You are gonna pay more for price on parts on this car, but you're getting a supercharged V8 luxury European car as compared to your standard Grand Cherokee. But if you ask me, that is plenty okay. I love that you can hear the blower a bit from stock. I don't think you really could with the Jag, to be honest, but you can hear that little bit of low whine plenty well when you're driving this car. It's enough that for a factory configuration it sounds good, but yet it's not overbearing, and that's quite fantastic. Of course, being who we are, there is good chance that as we go along, we'll be doing some mods and having some fun with this thing, so you hear the supercharger a bit more. But for factory, I'm quite impressed with how loud it is. I don't know if it comes through on camera or not, but this thing is so quiet on the road. Obviously, we're gonna go and ruin that between the supercharger, as we were just talking about, and the exhaust. It is going to get quite a bit louder, but it should stay very comfortable. Like, there isn't really many boxes that at least the driving experience doesn't check off on these cars. Like, they're great on fuel for what they are when you're imagining or remembering that this is a supercharged V8 big SUV. It does quite fantastic in that way. It's super comfortable. The stereo is really good. It has all the creature comfort features that a guy could want. It's pretty hard to argue with. The long story short with this car truly is, if you're willing to be open to doing some due diligence, making sure you find a car that has a good maintenance history and has had the major things addressed / taken care of, and you're willing to be okay with the sacrifice of a little bit of ease of use in reliability and having to be on the ball as far as, well, probably don't take it direct to Range Rover, probably take it to another trusted shop, and or if you're like myself, do the work yourself. If you can take all these things in and be okay with the fact that yes, you're getting a very expensive car for very cheap, and there's gonna be some sacrifice in that, but the sacrifice you're gonna realistically have to give is a substantial chunk lower than people will have you believe, these cars are phenomenal. I seriously, I cannot oversell that enough. Through work now, I have gotten to spend some time in some really cool stuff. I have driven around the G-Wagons, I have driven around your Uruses, and a lot of the other super high-end stuff, your Cayenne GTSs and turbos, all of these super high-end expensive cars, most of which being the ones I've driven in the $100,000 to $200,000 range or even higher. If you look at what this is compared to those, yes, say something like a Lamborghini Urus at $300 and some thousand, it is a better car. It does have nicer materials, but you're spending 40 to 50 times more on that car. And when you take that into account, this really does perform 80% as well. It doesn't quite have the same flex to it, you know, especially when you consider that a Urus has a Raging Bull badge on the front of it. But that's kind of okay, because for what this is, you really do compare to a lot of the Titans in this area for super cheap. Even the newer Range Rovers, for example, a newer Range Rover Sport still has the same 5-liter supercharged engine that this does, and is still close enough that, I mean, you can go spend $50, $80, $120, $130,000 on a newer variant of this car. And if you can afford it, there's nothing wrong with doing just that, especially if you have something with warranty, especially if you want the latest and greatest or want something a bit newer. If you don't care about that as much though, and you're looking to stay on a budget, this car is nearly impossible to beat. You can find one of these in an infinite number of spec options between exterior and interior colors. They do fantastic. They still have almost every feature that a new modern car is going to, and they drive so well. I will caveat, I probably wouldn't be as gung-ho to buy something that doesn't have the 5-liter supercharged in it. If you find something with the naturally aspirated 5-liter or any of the V6 options or whatever else, I would be a lot less gung-ho. I personally just don't have the experience with the other configurations of this car, and I truly think what makes this awesome is the fact that it is the top trim, super fast, super powerful variant at a cheap price. And I mean, for the $12,000 we spent on this, for example, I couldn't have really saved any money going for a lesser variant. And I think that's a massive reason to go buy a proper sport rather than a lesser trim. But maybe that is just me. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm super stoked for Hope about this new car. She is going to love it through the winter, and I apologize that we have not been posting a ton lately. That is going to change. The last little bit, there has been so much cool groundwork being laid on the work side of things, playing around with the supercar-esque stuff, but that does not mean we will not be doing a ton more through the garage, through the winter, and whatever else. Thank you guys for watching. The channel is so close to being monetized, which only means stuff gets bigger, better, crazier, and there's gonna be more of it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I can't wait to catch you in the next one. Go out and buy that Supercharged V8 Range Rover.